Hi, this is David Holmes again with the Sunday School lesson. Sorry we missed last week. I had some technical difficulties on my end, and so I didn't get the video to the pastor. So we missed last week, but now I'm back at it. So now we're on Lesson 10, which is titled The Battle Belongs to the Lord. And the scripture we're going to be reading is Judges 7, 1 through 8, and 19 through 21. So this week what we're going to discuss is God's role in our achievements. You know, our tendency is when we do something, we like to say, hey, look what I did. And we're going to talk about God's role in what we accomplish. And so the lesson talks about people love an underdog. And when the underdog wins, a lot of times it's called a miracle. Some of you who are old enough may remember the 1980 Winter Olympics in Lake Placid when the U.S. hockey team beat the Russians in hockey. And that was called the Miracle on Ice. And rightly so, because the Russians had won 5 out of the last 6 Olympic gold medals. And just 3 weeks before this game, they had played an exhibition against the U.S. and had beat them 10-3. So this lesson is going to show us another underdog that God is using for his purposes. So the first scripture we're going to read is Judges 7, 1 through 3. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. So if I hadn't messed up the video last week, what you would have heard is that after Joshua had died, that when a crisis would arise in Israel, God would raise up a judge to lead them. They didn't have a king, so these judges would temporarily lead the tribes. And Israel, of course, fell into the pattern where they would fall away from correct worship of God, and God would let their enemies take them over, and then a judge would be called up because the Israelites would call out for help. And the judge would come and set things right, and then as soon as the judge was gone, they'd fall right back into it. So what last week's lesson talked about was the judge Deborah and her partner Barak, who had led the Israelites against King Jabin. And after they had done that, the Israelites had 40 years of peace. But then they fell back into their old ways, and so God let the Midianites start encroaching on them, and they would come in and raid the land, steal their stock, and destroy their properties. And so they called out again for help. And so God called Gideon this time to come help them. And Gideon can remind you a lot of Moses when he was first called, because the first thing he did was come up with a whole bunch of objections as to why he was not the guy for the job. And he finally asked God to give him a sign so that he could be sure. And so he set up an offering, and the sign from God was that God sent holy fire down to burn up the offering. And the first thing he did then, Gideon, after that happened, is he ran out and he destroyed an altar of Baal. And the people were really mad about that because they had been worshiping Baal. And they went to his father and said, "Bring us your son because we're going to kill him for tearing up that altar." And his father's response was, "Oh, is Baal not God enough to take care of his own altars? He's got to send y'all to do it?" And so they kind of grumbled and went back about their business. And that's how Gideon got the name Jerubbaal, because it means something like, let Baal take care of him, right? Okay, so back to the situation at hand. Gideon had raised an army of 32,000 men to go attack the Midianites. But God said, if you go with that many men and get a victory, the Israelites are going to just take credit for that all by themselves. Look what we did. So he said, tell everybody who's afraid to go home. And when he did that, he was left with 10,000 men instead of 32,000. And then we come back to the scripture in Judges 7, 4 through 8. But the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you, and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home. So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300, who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. So Gideon had been left with 10,000 men, and God said that's still too many. He wanted to make it absolutely clear that the victory belonged to him and not to the hands of the Israelites themselves. So we're not going to go into the kind of weird way that he had him divide up his men, but the point is when it was all over, poor Gideon is only left with 300 men to go attack the Midianites. Now we're going to skip down to verse 19, but before we do, I'll give you a little background on what the skipped verses are talking about. It's the battle plan, basically. And what the Israelites did is each man had a trumpet in one hand and a torch in the other hand, but the torch was put inside of a jar. And so what Gideon was doing is he divided the men up, and he sent them around in the middle of the night to surround the Midianites and said, when I give you the signal, you're going to smash your jars and start blowing your trumpets. And so the Midianites then are going to wake up, and they're going to be surrounded by light and noise, and we'll see what happens. So then back to verse 19, it says, Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars. Grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow, they shouted, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. So, again, in the middle of the night, they smash their jars, and now the Midianites wake up, and it looks like they're surrounded by thousands of Israelites. And so they panic and they flee. And in fact, it's so bad that as they're running, they end up attacking each other in the dark. And the Israelites then pursued them and managed to kill 2 of their leaders, Oreb and Zeb. So here, one other thing to remember is if the Israelites had a torch in one hand and a trumpet in the other hand, those 300 men did not even have swords with them. So there's no way they can go back and say that they won this battle. It was certainly all God's doing. So the lesson ends with the question, what lessons can be learned from the battle fought by Gideon with only 300 men against thousands? So as we go out and accomplish things, let's try to remember how much God played a role in that.